Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jean-Jacques Mitakaru JJ with Business Link. Thank you so very much for joining us for our webinar today. I would like to start out with a land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge that in the province of Alberta, we are situated on traditional territories of Treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, ancestors' homeland of diverse First Nations groups, Métis, and Indigenous people, whose ancestors have walked this land since time immemorial, and whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. We pay respects to the Indigenous people of this land, past, present, and future, while recognizing their cultural heritage, beliefs, and the relationship to the land on which we reside. And thank you again for joining us for this webinar today. Todd Hirsch, Vice President and Chief Economist of ATB Financial, will join us with Alberta's Economy 2022 What Now? If you'd like to ask questions during the webinar, please click on Q&A in the meeting controls and type a message into the question box. I will definitely read them through to Todd at the end of the session, so please be patient. I will be answering the questions at the end of the webinar. There may be questions actually typed in, as I mentioned, but they will be answered at the end. Slides won't be emailed out, but you will be able to access a recording of the presentation on businesslink.ca within 2 business days. So just you know, the information provided in this session is for general knowledge and should not be taken as professional advice. And now it's my pleasure to welcome you, Todd. Thank you so very much. You can definitely introduce yourself briefly, and you can take over. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jean-Jacques, for that introduction, and thank you to Business Link for inviting me back for a very 2022 kind of event, that being a webinar. We're all getting pretty good at doing this. Too bad we weren't able to be in person, but we do the best we can in these difficult and trying times, but it is very nice to be with you via video. I am currently residing in Treaty 7 territory in what we know as Calgary, but grew up in Treaty 6 territory in and around the Edmonton region. I've spent my entire life in Alberta and the last 27 years of it as an economist. So I feel like I understand this province and its economy fairly well, and I'm honored to be here this afternoon to share some of my thoughts about where Alberta's economy is going as we move forward. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and dive into my presentation. And Jean-Jacques, do you want to give me a verbal okay? You see that screen up there all right?
Definitely, I can see it. Fantastic.
The title of my presentation, Changing the Narrative, New Ways of Thinking About the Economy in 2022. I'm going to start, first of all, as I always love starting a presentation, with a story. It's a story about a young married couple starting out their life together. And one of the holidays, they decide they are going to do something very traditional, and that is have a roast ham dinner. So they get out the ham, and the young bride, she gets out a sharp knife and she slices off the tip of the ham. And her husband asks her, "Why do you slice off the tip like that?" And she says, "Well, that's just the way you prepare a ham. Before you roast it, you have to slice off the tip. That's what my mother always did." And the husband said, "Well, it seems like a strange thing to do. Why did your mother do that?" So they actually called up the bride's mother and they asked her, "Mom, why do you cut off the tip of the ham?" And she says, "Well, that's just the way you have to prepare a ham. That's the way your grandmother always did it." Oh, there's my dog barking. "That's the way your grandmother always did it." So they were still curious about this. They actually called up the grandma and said, "Grandma, why do you slice off the tip of the ham before you roast it?" And the grandma said, "Well, I never had a roaster big enough." So it's a cute story, and it teaches us an interesting lesson about narratives and about the way we sometimes think about things only because that's the way we've always thought about things. And notice this is not about tradition. Cutting off the tip of the ham was not a tradition that was passed on, and traditions can have a lot of very useful purposes. cutting off the tip of the ham was something very practical that at one point did have a practical reason, but no longer did. So I want to use this theme of talking about narratives, sometimes the way we get stuck in thinking about things in a certain way. And I want to apply that to Alberta's economy. I want to suggest there are three narratives that we tell ourselves about our economy that we have to be careful that we don't get stuck there. And in some ways, we have to change that narrative to think about Alberta in the 21st century. So I'm going to share these three narratives with you, and then I will conclude my presentation with our current economic outlook, what we're expecting for Alberta's economy in 2022 and beyond. So the first narrative that I want to share with you is this one story we tell ourselves, that resources are the source of our wealth. Now, this is a pretty common narrative. If you asked anybody in Alberta why Alberta has been such a prosperous place, people would likely say, well, we've got a lot of oil and gas. And while that is true, there is something much deeper to this story. And I want to challenge, in fact, that it's not because of oil and gas that we're wealthy. It's because of something else. I want to borrow, actually, a quote from the father of modern capitalism, of all people, Adam Smith, in his book, The Wealth of Nations. It was not by gold or by silver, but by labor that all the wealth of the world was originally purchased. Adam Smith understood very well that it's not a resource that makes you wealthy, but it's the labor that is applied to that resource. So with respect to Mr. Smith, I'm going to take his quote and I'm going to break it down a little bit. I'm going to change a few of the words to make it relevant to us here in Alberta in 2022. We could say it was not by oil or by natural gas, but by labor, and in turn, I'm going to replace that with productivity, creativity, innovation, and good ideas, that all the wealth of Alberta was originally created. This is what Adam Smith was sort of on about. And I think this is the way we need to think about our resource sector in 2022. It's not the oil and gas molecules in the ground that make us wealthy. Rather, it's the productivity, creativity, innovation, and good ideas within our energy sector. That's the piece that creates the wealth. Now, you've probably all seen this I Heart Canadian Oil and Gas t-shirt, our friends at the Canada Action Coalition, and they do great work, by the way, in helping promote Alberta's and Canada's oil and gas industry, saying that we need to be proud and support our oil and gas industry. And they do great work. But with respect to their t-shirt, I want to tweak it just a little bit and replace what's on the front there with this: I Heart Canadian Productivity, Creativity, Innovation, and Great Ideas in the Oil and Gas Industry. For me, anyway, this is what I'm proud of. This is what I heart. It's the labor. It's the bright ideas. It's the creative minds within our energy industry. And the difference is not trivial. The difference between loving the oil and gas molecules and rather loving the productivity and creativity in the industry. Because if it's the productivity, creativity, and innovation, if that's what we love, this is really good news. Because I don't know if any of you have noticed, but the world there's a bit of a conflicted relationship right now with oil particularly and hydrocarbons more generally. There is a war on hydrocarbon. Now, the irony is not lost on anybody in Alberta that all of the people at the COP26 event in Scotland last fall to deal with climate change, they all flew very expensive planes to get there and used a lot of oil, burned a lot of jet fuel in the process. Now, I don't want to be critical of that, but I do want to suggest that we are in a bit of a corner here in Alberta because our energy industry is under attack. But the good news is it's not the oil molecules we love. Again, it's the productivity, creativity, and innovation. And if we apply that in the 21st century to creating the world's highest and most environmentally sensitive energy industry, moving towards net zero carbon within our energy industry itself, and also clean energy technology and renewable energy, this is what gets me excited, because it paints a path forward for Alberta and our resource industry. It's not the oil and gas molecules that make us wealthy, but rather it's the productivity, creativity, and innovation. That is what's going to lead our industry and our province forward. So that's the first narrative. It's not the oil and gas that make us wealthy, but rather it's the bright minds and ideas in the industry. The second narrative that I want to dive into is this idea that you get a job to earn income. Now, every single one of us, I would dare say, if we are working, the income that we earn is likely a pretty important part of why we're working. Most of us don't volunteer, although some people do. But most of us, we work and earn a paycheck. But this narrative that it's the only reason why you work is to earn income. This is an outdated narrative and one that needs to be rewritten. And it changes the way we think about our relationship with our work and our jobs and our careers. Let me take you through a bit of a timeline over the last 100 years describing the changing nature of work. Or pardon me, before I get there, I forgot about this slide. Most of you, if you've ever taken economics in college or university, and you took a labor economics course, you would recognize this. I hope it doesn't give you nightmares from your days in micro and macroeconomics. But this is a pretty typical model from the 20th century. This would have been in the 50s and 60s, the way they thought about labor economics. It was a trade-off between leisure hours and work hours. Those were the only two considerations. So along that bottom axis, along the bottom is leisure hours, and along the vertical axis is work hours. And those were the only two things you consider. Do I want to be working more and earning money, or do I want more hours and leisure? But this is a very outdated way of thinking about work. There are a lot of variables in 2022. Now let me take you through the time horizon, the evolution of what we call a work-life balance. Let's start 100 years ago, 1922. For the average Canadian, and at the time, this would have been men in the workforce, as women had not really entered the workforce in great numbers. But the average male Canadian, this is what his life would have looked like. There was an early part of his life, that blue bar, spent in education. But it likely wasn't even to grade 12. It probably would have been more like grade 8 or grade 10 education. Very few people on a relative basis went on to post-secondary education. So that blue bar was a pretty short period of life, but the minute you left school, you entered the work world and you were expected to work long, hard hours for a lot of your life until the very end. And then we see a short period of time, that red bar representing retirement or leisure. Work at the time was largely in factories and on farms. It was normally very manual and very physically intensive work. There weren't a lot of breaks. You didn't get a lot of holiday time. Work life was pretty difficult, pretty challenging. Retirement, as I said, was a short period of time. Now, you might wonder, why was retirement such a short period of time? Well, in fact, it was in 1920 when retirement age was selected at age 65 and the Canada Pension Plan was established. But the reason age 65 was selected as retirement age, that's because age 66 was life expectancy back 100 years ago. So you think about that, you only had on average a year to live after you retired, and half the people didn't even make it that whole year. So this idea of retirement, it was a very, very short period of time, usually just towards the very end of your life. So that's the very simple work-life balance in 1922. There's not a lot of complexity to it. Let's fast forward to just after the Second World War, 1945. Well, now we see education starting to be a longer period of time, more K-12, more common, and starting to see more people entering vocational colleges or universities. Still a long, pretty much unbroken period of time. You notice retirement at the end is starting to be a little bit longer as Canadians are living longer. But a new development shows up, and that's called unemployment. And in 1940, Canada established its unemployment insurance program. This was a program to address these very short but occasional bouts of unemployment. The factory you worked in laid you off, so you were without income for a short period of time until you walk down the street and the next factory hires you. So these short but occasional bouts of unemployment start to show up in terms of your work life. The 1960s to the 1970s, well, again, you start to see more periods of unemployment. You start to see leisure and retirement at the end of your life, that red box, even longer. Education taking up now a longer period of your life. It's a period of time when more women are entering the job market. And we start to think about this concept of a career takes shape. In fact, I dare say it was, no one before 1950 would have said, do you love your job? Does it fill your passions? I don't think we asked children back in the early part of the 20th century, what do you want to be when you grow up? These were questions that we started to ask children in the 60s and 70s. And this idea that not only does your job provide income, but in a lot of ways, it should provide a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction. This is a new development in our relationship with work and life. Retirement, as said, is a longer period of time as life expectancy increases. Now let's move forward to the 1980s to the year 2000. Well, here we start to see even more complexity. Unemployment is not only more frequent, but those dark red bars, they're starting to be a little bit wider in terms of people, their bouts of unemployment might go on for a year or even longer, especially in the recession of the 1980s, where we saw people without work for extended periods of time. You also notice those blue bars start to show up as you work through your life in terms of the idea of lifelong learning, that you would go back perhaps and take upgrading and training. Bouts of unemployment become longer. Training and retraining become more common. The idea of this MBA, the weekend MBA programs, or it was a period of time, the 1980s and 90s, when computer technology started to show up on your desks in offices, and people needed training for how to work this new technology. So we see education become a more permanent fixture. The other big development is parental leave, represented by those two yellow bars. Normally, early in people's careers, and normally women, but also men, as parents take leave to care for young children, this expectation that, in fact, you would be allowed to step away from your job in order to give care to young children. That's a brand new development that started to become more common in the 80s and 90s. Then we move to the year 2000 to the year 2020. Now we start to see even greater complexity. We might start to see work, represented by the light green bar, showing up in education. The idea that high school students, or for sure university students, would often be expected to be holding down a part-time job while they're still a student. You start to see different colors of green bars, represented by that shorter green bar about in the middle of this diagram, where you might be working two different jobs at the same time. Parental leave showing up there, the yellow bars, the red bars of unemployment, and of course the blue bars of education. We start to see a more and more complex work-life balance. The other thing that shows up is perhaps later in your career, you may take leave from your job in order to care for aging parents or extended family. Something that again is becoming even more common. It's no longer just childcare, but also care for aging family members. You may decide at some point in your career to go down to part-time work, or maybe leave the job market altogether in order to do a sabbatical or take some leisure time off. That's something that was relatively new. Work after the age of 65. So we start to see those green bars reoccurring after we've retired, because more and more people after age 65, they're still very lively. They're healthy. They want to contribute. They're not ready to just sit on the couch. They want to actually have a sense of participation. So some of them return to the job market, maybe part-time jobs, maybe in a mentoring role. Also the gig economy. So I've got a little bar there at the beginning where there are three different colors of green. representing often young people, but it could be anybody, representing this idea that you might be working 2 or 3 or even more jobs in order to cobble together enough income. The idea of this gig economy and working multiple jobs, more and more common in the 21st century. And then we get to year 2022, where we're at now. So we see a lot of complexity, a lot of different bars coming and going. It is no longer the simple unbroken green bar like it looked like 100 years ago. There is a lot going on. And watch what happens to that light green bar in the background. Working from home or working from a remote location. As all of us have moved through COVID, and this was happening, by the way, before COVID, but COVID certainly accelerated this idea that work can take place anywhere. Now, I do have to be clear about this. There are a lot of jobs, a lot of people's occupations where working remotely is not possible. If you work, for example, in healthcare, or you work in food and accommodation, or retail, or construction jobs, those are the types of jobs that, you can't just work from home. You have to be on site in order to be working. However, there are many, many other jobs, especially in the service industry, where working remotely and working from home have now become a common expectation of workers. So I've shown that green bar with all different sort of shades of green and white, representing that as we move through our career, where we work is changing. So you look at this bar in 2022, it is really complicated. It is not simple anymore. And that's the narrative that I'm trying to challenge, is that you no longer get a job just to earn income, although that remains important, of course. But now our relationship with our jobs and our relationships with our careers is also about fulfillment. It's also about, how do I balance work and life? How do I integrate work and life? It's about respect. It's about the sense of participating. So because of this, we have to think differently about the world of work, our careers and our jobs. Income will be one factor, but employers are going to have to look at a whole different range of incentives, including working remotely and being able to offer flexibility if they are going to attract and retain workers in the future. The third narrative that I want to cover off before I conclude is to talk a little bit about inflation and the narrative that we've told ourselves that when inflation crops up, interest rates will respond. Now, in 2022, I don't know if any of you have been noticing, I sure have been noticing, but we are seeing inflation rates that we haven't seen in Canada in 30 years. And in the US, they hit 7% in December, the highest in 40 years. And a real question among economists and a big debate is the inflation that we are seeing now, is this temporary? Sometimes they call it transitory, or is this something more permanent that is going to now affect consumers? I want to describe 4 factors that is driving inflation at the moment. And because of these 4 factors, why traditional ways of dealing with inflation, which would be the central bank raising interest rates, why we're not likely to see the same kind of response. Let's dive into the 4 factors that's driving inflation at the moment. The first, obviously related to COVID, and that is just global supply chain disruptions. All sorts of things over the last 2 years, because factories have gone down all over the world. Transportation linkages like shipping and rail and trucking, they've been disrupted for a lot of different reasons. And that means that our just-in-time supply chains that the whole world has become quite accustomed to, in a lot of ways, these have broken down. And we're just not seeing the same speed of delivery. And that has left some shortages, and that has pushed up price, as there are now fewer goods being sold. So this is entirely related to COVID, but that is the first factor, supply chain disruptions. Factor number 2 has to do with commodity prices, particularly food commodity prices, and a lot of this is related to climate change. We are seeing increasing numbers of crop failures around the world because of drought, because of extreme heat, because of extreme flooding. Now, I'm not an environmental scientist. This is not my area of expertise, but the scientists are telling us that we can expect more climate change disruptions, likely leading to more incidents of crop failures. And not only crops, but commodities like crude oil, which for reasons unrelated in a lot of ways to COVID, we are seeing high oil prices. That gets translated and passed on down to higher prices for consumers. The third is wage price inflation. A lot of employers, more so in the United States than in Canada at the moment. So far in Canada, we have not really seen a lot of wage growth. We've seen some, but in the United States, because of labor shortages, employers are having to offer higher and higher wages to attract workers. And because they're having to pay higher wages, they pass on those costs to consumers who pay higher prices. And the final factor leading to inflation is traditional pent-up consumer demand. A lot of consumers during COVID they're actually sitting on a lot of money. Their income may not have been disrupted. A lot of people, their income has been, but a lot of other people, especially higher income people, their income has not been disrupted, but they've been prevented from spending money on a lot of things that they normally would have spent money on, like vacations or recreation, sporting events, those kinds of things. So they're sitting on a lot of money, and they're spending money on things like home renovations. They're spending money on new decks in their backyards. That consumer demand is pushing up prices to some degree. So here we've got four factors. Now, you'll notice they're all kind of interrelated. They're not seamless, and you can't keep them in silos because there's sort of passover between one and the other. But four unique factors leading to inflation. The problem for central banks is the first three factors are not going to be addressed by higher interest rates. The supply chain disruptions, the crop failures, the wage price inflation, that is not solved by higher interest rates. The fourth factor, strong consumer demand, consumers chasing goods and services, that is sort of the traditional way that central banks quell inflation, is by raising interest rates. So that one will be affected, but the other three won't. Now, this leaves the Bank of Canada and other central banks around the world in a really interesting predicament, because on one hand, they are seeing the highest rates of inflation we've seen in decades, and they are under a lot of pressure to do something. But the central banks also know that raising interest rates is going to be ineffective for three of the four factors leading to inflation. And they're wondering, well, we could raise interest rates, but will that even solve the problem of inflation? And might it even make the situation worse, especially for those people who, for example, might see higher mortgage rates, higher borrowing costs? Might this actually tip us back into recession? Now, I always joke, central banking and comedy, it's all in the timing of getting the rate increases timed perfectly. Now, we're going to see, in fact, tomorrow, a statement from the Bank of Canada. It's one of their scheduled fixed announcement dates. There is some speculation in the markets that the Bank of Canada is going to raise interest rates starting tomorrow. Now, I don't know. It's sort of a flip of the coin. If they did raise interest rates tomorrow, it would be unusual because, in fact, the Bank of Canada, like other central banks, they like to give lots of notice of what they're thinking. They like to sort of give the market some warning or some heads up. In other words, the Bank of Canada has not really yet been talking about interest rate increases. So if they did raise rates tomorrow, that would be unusual, but I don't think it's out of the question. However, I do think what we're more likely to see, if they don't raise rates, we will see rates kept steady, but very strong statement from the Bank of Canada that inflation pressures are building. That will set us up for rate increases probably in March, and likely followed by 4 other rate increases over the next year and a half. So there's no question interest rates are going higher, but the question that remains for these central banks, is it even going to do any good with dealing with inflation? So just to summarize these 3 narratives that we have to re-examine. It's the creative, innovative, and educated labor. That's what drives wealth creation in our resource sector, not the oil and gas molecules themselves. Employment is about fulfillment and has become much more complex as our relationships with our work and our career have evolved. And finally, inflation pressures may be here to stay, with the Bank of Canada reacting less aggressively, knowing that in fact, if they raise rates too fast, too quickly, it may not even do a lick of good and in fact may do more damage. Now, with that, I want to conclude on our current economic outlook. My economics team, we take a deep dive in the assumptions, things affecting Alberta's economy. We do this every quarter. Our most recent forecast, which came out in November, now I will let you know we do have a new one that will be coming out sometime in late February. But at the moment, we are expecting real GDP growth in Alberta of 4% this year, followed by 2.5% next year. And that's pretty good growth rates. And in 2021, we likely saw growth. We don't have all the final numbers in yet, but Alberta's economy probably grew by about 6% last year. So we are seeing a nice kind of rebound, but I caution, no one should be doing a victory lap about this economic growth because, in fact, the hole that we dug in 2020, when our economy shrunk by 8%. So, of course, as COVID restrictions have been lifting over the last couple of years, not lifted all the way yet, but as the economy has opened up, of course, we would expect this natural growth spurt. But notice, even with growth of 4% this year, it's likely going to take us halfway through 2022 for the economy, for Alberta's economy to return to pre-COVID levels. That's how deep the recession was in 2020. So we're not even back to where we were at the beginning of pre-COVID, February of 2020. The unemployment rate, even with the growth that we're seeing, is likely to remain stuck around 7.5%. And that is because, yes, there are new jobs being created, and that's good news. But there were a lot of people that dropped out of the workforce altogether. And as those jobs start to come back, we're going to see more people re-entering the job market. They're going to start their job hunt all over again, and that's going to keep the unemployment rate elevated. We do expect growth in a lot of sectors, technology and digital sectors, agriculture, and especially agri-foods. And I just want to put a little asterisk beside agriculture because I know a lot of producers, a lot of farmers are really struggling at the moment with feed prices, with availability of feed. Crops last year were not particularly good because of drought. So traditional agriculture, the wheat, the canola, the cattle, they will probably struggle a little bit, but some of the newer forms of agriculture, some of the more diversified crops, and especially agri-foods, we expect to do well. Renewable energy and clean energy technology, and this is where I'm very excited, returning again to those, it's the creativity, innovation, and great ideas that exist in this province. Our traditional hydrocarbon producers, oil and gas, those prices right now are really good, and the industry, I think, will be stable. We're seeing some growth coming back there, but I think where we'll see even more action and more excitement and investment is in the renewable and clean energy technologies. But there are some risks to our somewhat rosy forecast. We always have to talk about the severity of the Omicron wave that we're in. Now, there are some signs and suggestions, at least in other parts of the country and the world, that Omicron has peaked and is now on the decline. I don't know. I'm not here to speak for Dr. Hinshaw and the case here in Alberta. I don't know, but I think we can anticipate that as we move into February and beyond, Omicron will ease up, but we don't know the timing of this. We don't know the severity. And we don't even know if there is yet going to be a sixth wave of this. We all hope not, of course, but there's a lot of uncertainty around the movement of this pandemic. Geopolitical events around the world. I don't know if most of you are sort of watching right now the tensions between Russia and the Ukraine and Russia and NATO forces, particularly the United States. It is not looking great. Now, again, this is not my area of expertise, but if we did see conflict, if we did see things escalating in that part of the world, that tends to be negative for markets and negative, generally speaking, for the global economy. And if we were to see the US and global economy slowing down, that would affect us here in Canada and Alberta as well. And finally, related to all of this, oil prices. As I just mentioned a minute ago, oil prices right now are really good, but there's no guarantee that they'll stay there. They could spike even higher, maybe up to $100 a barrel. And I would suggest $100 a barrel oil. You know, there's going to be a lot of champagne corks popping here in Alberta, but I would not suggest that is short-term good news, but long-term, it's not great news for Alberta, because $100 oil or higher is certainly to be followed by another oil collapse. Now, we can't control oil prices. What we would like to see, or what I'd like to see, is oil price stability, maybe around $60 WTI. Of course, we don't get to choose that, but I would suggest that we shouldn't be cheering too hard if oil prices climb up to $100 a barrel, because that is very short-term good news for Alberta. Medium and longer term, it really just represents this roller coaster of severe up and down. So that's our outlook, where we see the province this year and next year. Overall, pretty good, but we have to keep in mind those risks. There's always uncertainty. With that, I want to thank you very much for listening. I've gone a bit over time. I do want to take 30 more seconds to plug my podcast, which is called The Future Of. We are now halfway through season 3 of The Future Of. I get a chance in every episode to sit down with a really fascinating guest, where we talk about the future of all sorts of things related to our economy and our society. So if you're a podcast listener, you can search for that on your favorite podcast app, or you can always listen on atb.com. With that, I will return to you, Jean-Jacques, and if you would like to perhaps kick off, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer some of those now.
Perfect. Thank you so very much, Todd, and thank you for everyone who is participating here. So let me start with a comment from Melanie. She says that she's so glad that Todd is addressing the effectiveness of interest rate increases on cost-push inflation. That's a comment. And Mike's question is, if interest rate increases can only affect consumer demand, how effective is it? Because those people that have money to spend are probably less likely to be strongly affected by the interest rate increases. That's from Mike.
That's sort of the crux of the problem for the Bank of Canada, because I think they know. I mean, I used to work at the Bank of Canada, and I know the way they deliberate these things. I would love right now to be a fly on the wall in the inner sanctum of governing council at the Bank of Canada, how they're talking about this, because I think they know that they're under a lot of pressure. You guys have to do something, raise rates already. But I think they know they are not going to be as effective as they have been at other points in history when inflation was more generally driven by strong consumer demand. Now, as we outlined, there's a lot of factors going on. And maybe to the point that was made in the question, it is higher income people that have amassed a lot of savings and a lot of money. They're not going to be as affected by an increase in interest rates as perhaps somebody that has to borrow. So yeah, it's going to be a really interesting year to watch. I'm fascinated to see what the Bank of Canada is going to say tomorrow and give us some suggestion of how they're thinking about how to deal with this.
Perfect. Thank you, Todd. This one is from Carlos. Hi there. The economy of Alberta is heavily dependent of oil and gas. Would you share your oil price expectation for the next 2 to 5 years?
Yeah, that's a great question, because so much of our industry does sort of hinge on where those oil prices are going. At the moment, we are expecting average WTI prices in our forecast for 2022 of $73 US a barrel. Right now, we're about $10 higher than that. But around December, it was $10 lower than that. So these oil prices, they are notoriously difficult to predict. They fluctuate on, it could be one comment by Vladimir Putin today about Ukraine, and oil prices could hit $100 a barrel. Or there could be, another outbreak of another variant of this pandemic, and oil prices could sink $10. So it's really difficult to predict. We generally go with what in the industry is called the forward strip. In other words, those people who trade oil stocks. It's not that they're always correct on these things, but it does give us a sense of where the market thinks oil prices is going. And that's why we chose $73 WTI average price for 2022.
Thanks again, Todd. I have two questions, actually, one from the chat box and the other one from Q&A box, and they are very similar. The one from chat box is from Patricia. How about real estate growth? And the other one is, what is the real estate outlook for 2022?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And I guess it depends if we're talking residential real estate, if we're talking commercial, or if we're talking what city or market. Even in a city like Calgary, where I live, residential, there's probably at least 30 identifiable markets, and they all kind of move a little bit differently. But so I'll try to be brief. Let's talk about residential real estate. Most people seem to be more interested in that because more people tend to be homeowners than office tower owners. Residential real estate in Alberta, I think, will be pretty good in 2022. What will temper prices are the interest rate increases that we are going to see, maybe as soon as tomorrow, but certainly in March or later. That will kind of temper the market a little bit. We have seen some escalation in prices and activity in 2021. Stronger, I think, than I would have expected, given that in 2021, the province was still dealing with COVID and a lot of economic, challenge. Nonetheless, residential real estate has been performing pretty well, and I think it will continue in 2022, tempered by some of those rate increases. Commercial real estate is a big miss, especially in Calgary, to a less degree in Edmonton. But I mean, the reality is we've built far too many office buildings. And now, even before COVID, with the downturn in Alberta's energy sector, there just was not as much demand. With COVID, more and more companies are seeing workers working from home. They don't need as much space. So we are left in a city like Calgary with 30% of those offices downtown vacant. That is going to take a while to fill back up. I think we will do it. It might take 5 years or more. But what I am certain about is that when it does fill up, we're not just filling it back up with cubicles of office workers. It is going to be used for other more creative and maybe in some ways more interesting uses of space. Things like education, things like recreation space, museum, art and culture space. So commercial real estate is more challenged than residential real estate, but we'll get past this too.
Perfect. Thank you. Todd, do you see another recession coming in the near future? That one is from Laura.
Oh, in the near future, no. Simply because, they're not always 100% reliable, but there are these business cycles that generally the global economy goes through. And at the moment, we are on an upswing of a business cycle. In other words, the recession of 2020 is behind us. 2021, 22 are growth years. Now, anything could disrupt that. A global outbreak of a war, another pandemic. Those are not in my forecast, so I am not forecasting another recession in the near future. But we always have to remember, we can never say never. My guess is we won't see a global or Alberta or Canadian recession in 2022 or 2023. Looking out beyond that, 24, 25, 26, we know that another recession is inevitable at some point, but it's not in my near term or even medium term future. Or my outlook.
Perfect. Thank you. So is that a good time to buy a house, Todd? That's one from Dora.
Well, it depends who you are, but it could be a great time to buy a house. It also depends on, what kind of financing you need. Do you need a 25 or a 30-year mortgage? Even with interest rates starting to go up, it's still a really favorable time to buy. or to finance a house through a mortgage because interest rates are still very, very low. So it could be a good time to buy. It also depends on your time horizon. Are you young and early and building a family? Or are you, maybe looking at downsizing? Your kids have left the house and you're looking at perhaps building or buying something different. So there's a lot of variables right now, and I would never want to say for everybody, now is the time to buy a house, but interest rates are still very favorable, which could mean for a lot of people, it's maybe an interesting time to look at home buying.
Perfect, thank you. From Kelly, what do you think the role of small businesses is in the recovery of the economy?
Oh, it's so important. And I love this question. And I'm glad Kelly asked it. Small businesses, really are the heart and soul of our economy. I know we tend to look at the big companies. We tend to look at the big oil and gas companies, the Suncors and the CNRLs. We tend to look at Google and Amazon. But the heart and soul of our economy and our communities is really around small business. It is so important that we all recognize that and that we do everything we can to support those small businesses. And honestly, I don't want to badmouth Amazon. And there's lots of times when, ordering something from Amazon, it is really the only option. But I would caution all of us, Amazon does not need 10 more cents of your purchases. Your small businesses in your community do. And even if that comes with a bit of a price premium, and it doesn't always, remember, but we would really miss those small businesses if they are not able to hold on, because they are so much more than just a business. In a lot of senses, they are the fabric of our community and our cities. So it is so important that we support our small businesses and do everything we can to make sure that they're still around.
Perfect, thank you. And Gary, what about the trillions of dollars that government have given out for nothing?
Sorry, I cut out just a little bit. What about trade unions?
The trillions of dollars.
Oh, trillions of dollars
that the governments have given out for nothing.
Well, it's not quite fair to say they gave them out for nothing because a lot of those supports, a lot of the loans that they gave out, a lot of them will be repayable. But to say they gave it out for nothing isn't also right, because what they bought was, we avoided a complete collapse of our economy. So if we were to go back, and this is the problem with economics, you can never go back and repeat the experiment like in chemistry, let's do the experiment again, but this time let's not add sodium chloride. In economics, we can't go back, but it would be fascinating to say, let's go back to March 2020 and the COVID pandemic happens and governments did nothing. My guess is, now we'll have no way of proving this, but my guess is the economy would have collapsed. We would have seen 40% unemployment. We would have seen looting. We would have seen rioting. What the trillions of dollars, and in Canada, it's more like hundreds of billions, but what that bought us as a country was general stability of our economy. We got a lot for that in terms of we avoided absolute pandemonium. I think that's worth it. Now, people will debate for years if government should have spent that much money, if taxes are going to go up. All legitimate questions for sure, and reasonable people can disagree on that. But I don't think anybody, not even the most vehement fiscal conservatives, would say government should have spent nothing at the beginning of COVID. The degree to how much they're spending, sure, those things can be debated. But we have to remember what all that money bought us was our economy came out 2 years later generally intact. Even here in Alberta, the highest the unemployment rate got was 15%. Now that's really high, but it's not 40%, and it came down very quickly. So that's all I'll say about that. We have to recognize we did get some value for that money spent.
Perfect. And I have one from Alisa. How can Alberta use its changing economic future to try and attract and keep talent? We are already seeing a brain drain.
Yeah, this is something I'll confess I worry a little bit about. Because especially when you talk about young people, young educated people, they're very mobile. And the most mobile they'll be is the day they get their degree or their university certificate or whatever it is. And I do worry a little bit about, are we able as a province to attract and retain young people? Now, here's where it gets a bit complicated, because you could ask, well, what do we need to do to attract and retain them? For sure, jobs are a piece of it. But I also think that the values that we sort of convey as a province, they have to be in alignment with young people's values. Young people, and I don't want to say they're all the same because they're not, but young people generally have a stronger commitment and stronger feelings about environmental responsibility. I don't know if a lot of young people, want to connect with a place that perhaps doesn't care about its environment. I think Alberta needs to be a bit careful in conveying some of those values, some of the values around social inclusiveness, which is more important for young people than others. The type of society that we're creating. These are the questions young people are asking. And if what we convey as a province is not in alignment with young people's views and values, they're going to leave. Even if there is a job here for them, they are not going to see themselves, a future for themselves in a province where the values are misaligned. So jobs, for sure, we have to, look at that. But I think we also have to be very careful about what sorts of values are we conveying as a province? How are we using those values to attract and retain young people?
Perfect. I have a question from Anonymous here. Will tensions with China affect the economy?
Yes. The short answer is absolutely. And in fact, I would put that in one of the geopolitical risks, when I talked about the risks. Right now, all eyes are sort of more on Russia and Ukraine, but we're not out of the woods. US-China relationship is not fantastic. Canada's and China's relationship is not fantastic. I think China is a little annoyed with Canada at the moment. It might be over the way the whole Huawei executive thing went down. We were boycotting official presence at delegates at the Beijing Olympics. These things could escalate into broader trade wars, even perhaps some other kinds of conflicts. And again, anytime there's conflict, it doesn't matter if it's bombs being hurled at each other or just tariffs being slapped on. Conflict equates to negative outcomes, economic outcomes. So I think we have to, I don't know the answer to those questions because I don't think they're easy, but I think we need to pay attention to our relationship with China and we need to work with them. At the same time, we also need to press them on some of their human rights things that are not in line with our values as Canadians.
Perfect, thank you. And I have a question from Pierre. What strength does Alberta have when facing the current economic situation?
What?
Strength that Alberta has, yeah.
Oh, we have so many strengths. I think our biggest asset is, we talk a lot about it here in Alberta, but we really are an entrepreneurial province. People have moved here for decades. Because it's the place you can build something. You can build a business here. This is a place you move to roll up your sleeves and get involved. This is a place where it doesn't matter what your last name is or what prep college you went to or who your dad is. This is the place where you can participate, get involved and build something. It is entrepreneurial. And there's lots of evidence to kind of support that. We're not just making this up. I think that is our number one asset that we bring to the Canadian economy. In addition to that, our energy, for sure. Traditionally, it's been oil and gas, and we've talked a lot about that already this afternoon. But I do think Alberta, if we really put our minds to it, we need to change some of our reputation. But I think Alberta has every opportunity and possibility to lead Canada and the world in clean energy technology and renewable energy. There's no reason we can't be doing this. I think that's what the world is looking for. And I think that's Alberta's greatest economic contribution to the country.
Thank you. And I have a question from Raymond. Manufacture is the backbone in any country. What support does Alberta gives to manufacture?
Well, I don't know if I would say, if I would agree entirely that manufacturing is the backbone of every economy. It is of a lot of economies. Traditionally in North America, around the 1950s and 1960s, certainly manufacturing was the backbone. In 2022, it is more around the service economy. There's many more people, say, for example, in Ontario, employed in financial services, education, and healthcare services than there are in manufacturing. Here in Alberta, our manufacturing tends to be focused on refined petroleum, chemical production, agri-foods, some steel manufacturing around pipes and things related to the energy sector. Those things absolutely remain important and critical. I think the investments we're making right now in Alberta around petrochemicals is really positive. That's a big piece of our manufacturing infrastructure. But even in Alberta, we are more a service-oriented economy than a goods producing, than a manufacturing. Manufacturing, to a large extent over the last 50 years, has really moved to lower labor countries like China, Indonesia, and Vietnam.
Perfect, thank you. I have another one from question from Valerie. Do you forecast that commercial real estate owners and the property managers will increase spending to attract tenants?
They might. I think if they're going to increase spending, what they might have to do is sort of restructure or maybe redesign some of those office buildings, not in a major way. But, when you build an office building, traditionally it is meant to house office workers. It's not really designed to be a residence, for example. It's not really designed to be recreation space. So there might need to be some capital improvements or capital spend on some of those existing buildings. Some of them will, some of the older Class C, Class D commercial office buildings downtown, they'll have to be, destroyed or torn down. But I think the newer stuff, I think with a little bit of capital spending, not a lot, but to reconstitute those buildings towards other uses other than just office workers. So I think that's where we'll see it.
Perfect. And Ravi, how attractive do you see Alberta will become for foreign corporate investment? And what incentives are needed to trigger this by government?
Yeah, it sort of gets back to a similar conversation about attracting young people and retaining young people. Alberta, traditionally, we've been very strong in attracting international investment, particularly in our energy sector, particularly. Those dynamics are changing. And if Alberta wants to continue, I think we will, but if we want to continue to be a strong attractor of international energy investment, it's going to have to be around clean energy technology, renewable energy. You look at what international banks and big capital pools like BlackRock are saying. They are looking at all of these opportunities around the world. They're not building pipelines anymore. They're not funding traditional hydrocarbon extraction. They want to see what we call ESG, environmental social governance. Unless those opportunities are really strong in environmental, social, and governance, the big capital markets of around the world, they've got a lot of options for that money. And we're not going to be on that list unless we in Alberta decide we're going to be part of the solution. We are going to partner with the federal government and attract money from around the world around carbon capture and storage, around renewable energy and those other clean energy initiatives. So I think that's where we have the best opportunities.
So just, Todd, it's a very interesting topic. There are so many questions, so many thank yous, appreciation of the topic.
We can keep going all afternoon, I know.
I trust we'll have a chat and give you more than 1 hour in the future. So, however, I would like to end with this question from a young educated person.
Good.
Melanie, I'm a young educated person. We need to seriously invest in arts, culture, and technology. This uncritical allegiance to oil and gas will continue to disadvantage this province socially and economically. What do you say about this?
100% agree with that. And if anyone knows much about me, or if you Google me, I'm a huge advocate of art and culture. I'm on the board of Glenbow Museum, the Alberta Ballet, the Calgary Arts Academy. And I've talked a lot in previous presentations, what I call the CARS sector: culture, art, recreation, and sport. This is all about quality of life. This is all about making our cities and our communities wonderful places to live, not just low tax, I mean, that might be something. But, you know, there's a great saying, no one goes to Paris because of the ample free parking. That is not why anyone goes to Paris. You go there because it's an amazing city full of vibrance, art, culture. And I think our cities here, we need to pay attention to that. It is not trivial at all. If we are going to attract and retain the best and brightest from around the world, we have to offer more than, you know, just a rodeo and good fly fishing, although those are important, no disrespect to that, but we need a broad selection of art, culture, recreation, and sport. So absolutely, I think it was Melanie who asked that question. I couldn't agree more. Our investment in art and culture, especially right now in Alberta, is critical.
Yeah, thank you so very much. I have to agree with all the attendees. It's a great topic and, you know, great presentation. So I apologize for those questions that you didn't have time to answer. And I just want to thank you so very much, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you so very much, Todd, as always. If you'd like to contact Business Link, please email us at askus@businesslink.ca or call our toll free 1-800-272-9675. And if you're looking for one-on-one advice, would you like to sign up for our newsletter? Connect with us on social media, chat with us online, view recorded webinars, or stay informed on upcoming webinars, workshops, and events, please go to businesslink.ca. You will receive an email following this webinar with a link to an online survey. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey. It will help us improve. Thank you so very much, everyone. Thank you, Todd. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you so much. Be kind. Stay well, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.